Conference, thank you. Good afternoon. As our hearts go out to Las Vegas today, we're reminded again of the attack that took place here in this city only a few months ago on innocent and music-loving young people. And if there is a message to our American friends, it is this, that they will come through it and they will come back stronger. Because this city has shown that nothing and no one can bow the indomitable spirit of the people of Manchester. A city which in recent years has reinvented itself as the great thrumming engine of the northern powerhouse, with its vast potential to generate jobs in finance, in academia, in journalism, the arts, and that's just the ones held by my old friend, George Osborne. And since our subject this afternoon is how to win the future and build global Britain, I want to introduce our superb Foreign Office team, our PPSs, Connor Burns, Amanda Milling, our whip, David Evanet, our ministers covering the Middle East, already one of the most expert parliamentarians in that field, Alistair Burt, covering Africa, Rory Stewart. Thank you. That applause for these great men. And like the pharaohs of Upper and Lower Egypt, they are double-hatted ministers in the sense that they simultaneously represent the FCO and DFID, bringing together our foreign policy and our aid programs. In the Lords, we have Tariq Ahmad, who is working to ensure that next year in London, we make the most, at last, of an institution that takes 2.4 billion people, 52 of some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and unites them in admiration of the service provided by Her Majesty the Queen, the Commonwealth. And we will have a Commonwealth Summit to do her justice. Just back from Burma, I think, making clear this country's disgust at the treatment of the Rohingya, Mark Field, and dynamically triangulating between Europe and America, decoding President Trump to President Juncker, and vice versa. We have that Mount Rushmore of wisdom, Sir Alan Duncan. We have a great team, and we are getting on with the job. And yet, frankly, folks, as I absorb the general tone of the national conversation, I don't think I have ever known so many to be sunk in gloom and dubitation about Britain and the world. Every week, I pick up a fine British-edited international news magazine of the kind that you'll find in the briefcases of jet-setting consultants, glossy, covered, elegantly written, suspiciously unread. Every week, these publications have found new reasons to be slightly less than cheerful about this country. Every day, a distinguished pink newspaper manages to make Eeyore look positively exuberant. And across the world, it pains me to say it, across the world, the impression is being given that this country is not up to it, that we're going to bottle out of Brexit and end up in some dingy anteroom of the EU, pathetically waiting for the scraps, but no longer in control of the menu. And the most pessimistic of them all is not the media or our friends in the EU Commission or the excitable Monsieur Guy Verhofstadt. Far from it, it's Jeremy Corbyn, that NATO-bashing, trident-scrapping would-be abolisher of the British Army, whose first instinct, in the event of almost any international outrage or disaster, is to upend the analysis until he can find a way of blaming British foreign policy, and whose response to the grisly events in Venezuela is to side with the regime simply because they are fellow lefties. He says he still admires Bolivarian revolutionary socialism. I say he's Caracas. And it's beyond satire. It's beyond satire. At a time when the world should unite to condemn Venezuela's Maduro, we have the leader of Britain's official opposition, giving cover to a government that is jailing opponents, shooting demonstrators, intimidating journalists, and repressing human rights. It is a disgrace. And I can tell you, there are many Labour MPs who feel appalled that their party is still led by this man, with his peculiar belief expressed in glutinous victory-style rallies up and down the country that he somehow won the election. He didn't win. You won. We won. 56 seats ahead. Theresa May won. She won more votes than any party leader and took this party to its highest share of the vote in any election in the last 25 years. And the whole country owes her a debt for her steadfastness in taking Britain forward, as she will, to a great Brexit deal based on that Florence speech, on whose every syllable, I can tell you, the whole cabinet is united. And of all the areas where Corbyn is content to talk this country down, there is none more ludicrous and vacillating than his policy on Brexit. In the customs union 1 week, out the next, in the single market, out the next, in, out, faster than one of those members of the shadow cabinet who gets sacked before she knows she's even been appointed. A kind of manifestation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It would be disastrous if that negotiating strategy were put into practice. And in leaving Britain in limbo, locked in the orbit of the EU, but unable to take back control, unable to do proper free trade deals, Labour would inflict a national humiliation on us on a par with going cap in hand to the IMF. And yes, I know when you talk about the IMF in the 1970s, I'm aware that we come up against a difficulty. We must accept that we imagine that people immediately understand about power cuts, about the 3-day week union bosses back in Downing Street, state-made British rail sandwiches. We think people get the reference. But unfortunately, going back to the 1970s sounds to too many people like a massive joint revival concert by David Bowie, Led Zepp, and the Rolling Stones. And that is because people can't remember the Stones and Bowie, Led Zepp, monuments of our global culture, actually fled these islands, not led them, fled them. Might have been even more better if they'd led them, frankly. Fled these islands. They fled these islands, along with so many other wealth creators, because they were driven overseas by Labour's 83% tax rate. And people have forgotten today that we used to worry about the brain drain, not people wanting to come here. And they've forgotten that we, Conservatives, had to fight and win the battle of ideas. And in a way, it's entirely forgivable and understandable that amnesia has descended, because our victory has been so comprehensive. If you go around the world as I do and you listen to the aspirations of young people, you'll find not a single successful global economy that would dream of implementing the semi-Marxist agenda of McDonnell and Corbyn. And wherever you find enterprise and innovation and economic growth, it's because people have followed our ideas that were pioneered by our party, and in this country, by the way, in this city of Manchester. And from India to China to Thailand, Vietnam, where free markets, deregulation have been put into practice, they have helped to lift more people out of poverty faster than at any time in history. Go to the Central and East European economies. This party, not the Labour Party, helped on the path to democracy and freedom, and you'll see it in Estonia, a tech hub with a high degree of social protection. They have a flat tax of 20%. Romania, they have a flat tax of 16%, of free health and education and free higher education. Hungary, they have a tax rate of 15%. We're all really low tax conservatives, but even I think 15% is going it a bit. How crazy, therefore, a quarter of a century after the working people of those former Soviet bloc countries risked their lives to throw off the shackles of socialism, while the Labour left sneered at them and made excuses for their oppressors, the shadow leader and shadow chancellor are seriously proposing to place the British people back in bondage, a £200 billion renationalisation programme, a display of economic masochism that would do incalculable damage to the future of our children. And that's the difference between this Conservative Party and the Labour Party. We want a country with a government that works for everyone. Corbyn wants a Britain where everyone works for the government. And this battle of ideas is not lost in memories of the 1970s. It is back from the grave, its zombie fingers straining for the levers of power. And that is why we cannot rest. And we may have the most illustrious battle honours of any political party in the world. But now we have to win the battle for the future. And the way to win the future is not to attack the market economy, not to junk our gains, but to make it work better. Make it work better for the low paid, turning the living wage under this Conservative government into a national living wage. Make it work for all those who worry their kids will never find a home to own by building hundreds of thousands of homes, as we are, far more than Labour ever did. Make it work better for parents who can't find good enough childcare. 30 hours of free childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds every week. And above all, help people who are struggling by driving the benefit reforms that have helped millions back into the dignity and self-esteem that goes with a job, and which has seen inequality not rise, but fall, as Philip Hammond rightly said yesterday, to the lowest levels for 3 decades. And to win the future, we must communicate once again our great central idea of one nation conservatism. That for all its faults, an open, free trading and thriving market economy is the only sustainable way to create the wealth we will always need to help the poorest. The surest way to finance the platform of great public services and great infrastructure that themselves enable business to succeed. And the only way to win the future is not to retreat from the world, not to abandon globalization, but to play our part, as we always have, in making the world safer and freer and therefore more prosperous. And that is why we must believe in global Britain, not dismiss the very notion of a world role, as Jeremy Corbyn does, but accentuate and be proud of that role. There are places where it is simply our moral duty to British passport holders, like the overseas territories in the Caribbean, whose islands have been overwhelmed by the biggest catastrophe for 150 years. It's an eerie scene, not a leaf remaining on the shattered trees, houses turned into streaks of plastic and wooden litter, boats hurled on top of one another or lodged absurdly up hillsides. Of all the disasters I've seen in my lifetime, none has overturned the lives of so many UK nationals. And yet we should pay tribute to the unconquerable resilience of those islanders. And British islanders, by the way. And together with Priti Patel and Michael Fallon, this government will work to put them back on their feet. And of course, our responsibilities go still wider. When we protect the world, we protect British interests. When we campaign for the stability of the South China Seas, that is because through that narrow, pulsing jugular of the Malacca Straits, only 1.7 miles wide, goes fully 25% of world trade, including huge quantities of British goods. Across the Middle East and North Africa, we are helping to bring peace and defeat terrorism, not just because that is right in itself, but because these will be the great markets of the coming century. Just in the last few weeks, I've seen British troops training the Nigerian forces to defeat the numbskulls of Boko Haram around Maiduguri, where British doctors are tending the maimed victims of terror. And as our helicopter swooped over the burned and deserted villages, they said there was a risk of pot shots from behind. And I said that was an occupational hazard in my line of work. And every week, with UK help, the brave Nigerian forces are winning. But you can't just tackle the problem in Nigeria. Those terrorists, AK-47s, are being smuggled down through the desert from the chaos in Libya. And so in Tripoli, I've seen the charred ruins of our embassy, a smashed snooker table, the room where Tony Blair once held a banquet. But I was proud to run that Union Jack back up the flagpole. And that embassy is being rebuilt, with or without the snooker table. And if we in Libya, if we in the UK can help solve the problems in Libya, and we're making progress in Libya, then that country can also win a great future. And until we do, you will find British ships off the Libyan coast helping our Italian friends to cope with illegal migration. And that is what I mean by global Britain. That's what Pretty and Michael and I mean. Committed as team players and, when necessary, as leaders to the protection of the world and our common European home. I've just seen 800 British troops in Estonia and congratulated them on resisting the honey traps allegedly placed in their way by Russian intelligence. At least they said they'd resisted. They are a visible and powerful symbol of this country's unconditional commitment to defend the boundaries of Europe and the freedoms we won in the 1980s and 1990s. And I can't tell you how much our friends value Britain's contribution in Europe and around the world, because I think we've reached a unique phase in our history. We are big enough to do amazing things. We have the ability to project force 7,000 miles overseas, to use our permanent membership of the UN Security Council to mobilize a collective response to the crisis in North Korea. We contribute, as Pretty was just saying, 25% of European aid spending. We're the leaders. And yet no one seriously complains that we're bullies or that we have a sinister national agenda. And that's why the phrase global Britain makes sense, because if you said global Russia or global China or even, alas, global America, it would not have quite the same flavor. And I'm not saying that everyone automatically loves us all the time, or that everyone completely follows our sense of humor, though a lot more do than you might think, by the way. But there is a huge desire out there for us to engage with the world more emphatically than ever before. And after Brexit, that is what our friends and partners are going to get, as this country is freed from endlessly trying to block things in Brussels committee rooms, freed to stop being negative and to start being positive about what we believe in, including free trade. You see my friend Michael leading the clap there. And yes, we are leaving the EU. But as the Prime Minister has said in her Florence speech, we can create a deep and special partnership built on free trade, with a strong EU buttressed and supported by a strong UK. And since it is manifestly absurd to argue that European values or culture or civilization are somehow defined or delimited by the institutions of the EU, we will be no less European. Britain will continue to be European in culture, geography, art, history, architecture, spiritually, morally, probably. You name it. We are one of the great quintessential European nations, in many ways the most influential European nation of all. And that is because our most important exports are our values. British values, embodied not just here in this amazing metropolis of Manchester or in London, but across the country. A society that welcomes talent, that welcomed my ancestors from France and Russia and Turkey and heaven knows where, I'm sure my father could advise me, that is proud of the EU nationals and the other nationals that want to come here, that have enriched our lives, A society that doesn't judge you for where you come from or your background, or how you live your life, provided you do no harm to others. And that is the syncretic genius of our country. And it's thanks to that intellectual cross-fertilization that Britain is at the cutting edge of new markets and new technology. Think back to how the world has changed in our lifetimes. And then think forward. Let somebody take a film of me with a camera there. Think how crazy that would have seemed 40 years ago. It seems pretty crazy now, but think forward to what we can achieve in your lifetime, William Hague's lifetime. He's still got a long way to go. We are going to crack, we will eventually crack global warming with British clean technology and British green finance in which we lead the world, and we will get to a point where we can generate as much clean energy as we want. And eventually, we will stabilize our world populations, we will raise per capita GDP, and I'll tell you how, above all, by promoting female education. Which is at the heart of all British overseas policy. And we should be proud, you should all be proud, of the young women and girls that we are helping to teach around the world. As Priti has said, in Africa, in South Asia, 6 million of them in the Punjab in Pakistan alone. And if we can drive on with our friends that great cause of female empowerment and education, the Swiss Army knife that solves so many problems, then I believe we will eventually find a cure for the psychological contamination of radical Islamist extremism. Just as we eradicated smallpox and polio, it came and it will go. And of course, we will have problems. Humanity is always going to have problems of afflictions in mind or body, because without pain and doubt and anxiety, there can be no pleasure and no triumph and no success. But success will not be achieved by allowing the UK to retreat from our global role, but by reinforcing that role. And breakthroughs will not come through the edict of some Corbynist bureaucrat in some ministry of plenty, but through the effort of inventors and scientists and business people and students and dreamers, of whom we have so many. And to all those who are really worried about the UK today, let me remind you, it was only 8 years ago that we stood on the verge of the nastiest and deepest recession for 70 years. And I remember being taken up onto the roof of City Hall, which I then ran, by a female American TV journalist. And she rather took the wind out of my sails by saying, "Mr. Mayor, look around you." This was in 2008. Things weren't looking good. She said, "No one is building anything in your city." And she was right. All the cranes were down because confidence had gone, deserted us. All I can say is look at London today, storming ahead. Even if the new mayor isn't a patch on the last guy, by the way. He seems to spend his time rather ineffectually trying to ban things. Why can't he do something for a change? And then look at us. Look at the United Kingdom. The lowest unemployment rate for 42 years. The highest number of people in work ever. The #1 destination for investment into Europe. And every time one of these facts emerges, it is reported in tones of slight disappointment. And with the inevitable qualification, despite Brexit. It is time to stop treating the referendum result as though it were a plague of boils or a murrain on our cattle or an inexplicable aberration by 17.4 million people. It is time to be bold, to seize the opportunities. And there is no country better placed than Britain, which is not only the place where the atom was first split, but which has become a gigantic cyclotron of talent in which people are coming together from every discipline to produce constant flashes of inspiration. Indeed, We are consistently rated the global capital of innovation. We export more TV programs than any other country in Europe, 5 times more than the French. Yes. I think that's permitted in the laws of diplomacy. We export a program to Cambodia. A program to Cambodia called Nik Neng Kle Che Sethe, which means, who wants to be a millionaire? And it is thanks to the triumph of conservative values that you are allowed to become a millionaire in Cambodia these days without being dispatched for re-education by some Asiatic John McDonnell. We lead the world. We lead the world in bioscience and fintech and many other techs and some branches of artificial intelligence, cybernetics. What's Labour's first, what was Corbyn's first response on hearing the news that we lead the world in cybernetics? He wants to tax robots. Make them join the union. To ask you, did Manchester become great? Did Manchester become great by taxing the spinning jenny? We have a growing space program run by my brother Joe Johnson. And I have a candidate, my friends. For the first man we gently blast into orbit. And that is the superannuated space cadet from Islington. And I know he has an innocent and bold-trousered air, but his domestic policies, Jeremy Corbyn's domestic policies, would rack up debt that our children and grandchildren would be unable to pay. And his foreign policies would imperil not just this country, but our friends and our neighbours as well. Conference, we cannot allow it to happen. 200 years ago, people used to come to this city to see something revolutionary, the beginning of the modern world. And once again, this country has had the guts to try to do something new and different, to challenge received wisdom with a democratic revolution that we can turn into a cultural and technological and commercial renaissance. There are people who say we can't do it. We say we can. We can win the future because we are the party that believes in this country and we believe in the potential of the British people. We Conservatives have been privileged, collectively, to be placed in charge of this amazing country at a critical moment in our history. We are not the lion. We do not claim, like some others, to be the lion. That role is played by the people of this country. But it is up to us now, in the traditional, non-threatening, and genial, self-deprecating way of the British, to let that lion roar. Thank you very much.